first one is Tecumseh Fitch. He will talk about the biological evolution of the human capacity for language. And he's not only a professor and a scientist, I learned that he's also an artist and a composer. We won't ask him to sing or to play, but and he also likes to fight, that's actually quite interesting, to fight creationism with humor. So that would be. Having said all that, I think I'll now invite Tecumseh to give his talk.
So thank you, Jan. My original title was The Evolution of Language, but then I saw that Nick, who beat me to the punch, had already made his title The Evolutions of Language. And so I gave this new title, which is a bit long-winded, but just to make clear what I'm talking about, which is the early stages of language evolution, namely the acquisition in our species of our capacity to acquire language. And that is something that I think most people agree is part of our biology as human beings. All human beings share that. I'm going to have to drop out to make the audio work, so just bear with me for a moment. Okay. Whoops. Okay, that works, good. So the biological capacity to acquire language that we have in our species is clearly central to what we are as human beings. But you might ask, does it really deserve a place in this vast sweep, the 10 on 10? And I would argue that it does. And I'm just going to parrot the argument that Urs Satmari and Maynard Smith made in their book, The Major Transitions in Evolution. Why would language constitute a major transition in evolution? It's something that, as far as we know, only one species has, our own. So what makes it such a big deal? And I think the answer is, just like DNA, language provides a new method of biological memory, a new way to store accumulated information over time. And in us, what it enables is this amazing development of culture and of technology and everything else that really makes us special as human beings. So in a sense, this gives us a new form of biological memory. And of course today, I mean, the history of our species is developing technology. Today with writing and then the internet, I think we've really supercharged this basic ability of speech and turned it into something very new entirely. So I think it is reasonable to say that language is a key to innovation. And what I want to spend the rest of my talk doing, which by the way I thought was 60 minutes, not 45 minutes, so I should probably speak more rapidly, or maybe I'll skip over a few things and you can ask me details in the question section. So I've spent most of my career studying this, and one of the first things that you realize is that there's a sort of apparent conflict when you try and take the biological perspective, I'm trained as a biologist, of people like Darwin and neuroscience, and combine that with modern linguistics, here symbolized by Noam Chomsky, who's the sort of giant still alive in this field. And so a lot of the time that I've spent in this field has been basically trying to build bridges between the terminology and the conceptual structure of these different fields. And I think I think we've made progress. I was lucky enough to write a couple papers with Noam Chomsky and kind of start this grappling process, and this goes back almost 15 years now. But I think we still have a long way to go. There's plenty we don't understand about language. There's plenty of interchange between biology and linguistics that remains incomplete. And I think you'll see that illustrated. Nick is an actual linguist. I'm a biologist, so between the two of us, we should probably make clear how much of this bridge is built or remains to be built. But I think there's plenty of reason for enthusiasm and for optimism that we can actually do this. And I think there are three key developments in this field. One of them is basic to the cognitive sciences, and it's the idea that rather than treating language as one thing, that we need to break it into its component parts. And I'll give some illustrations of that in a moment. The second, and this is closer to my own heart, is that we need to be broadly comparative. So if we want to understand the biology of language, we need to look at a wide variety of species, not just humans and chimpanzees, but any species that has information relevant to these problems. And I'll illustrate that in the course of this talk. And then finally, and most excitingly, and I saw that you had Svante Pääbo here, so you may be familiar with this already, is the idea that we can use DNA recovered from extinct hominids to actually test hypotheses about when particular aspects of language evolved. I think that's a really exciting, still very new part of this. We only have a few tantalizing tastes of this, but I want to end with that. So just to illustrate this multi-component approach, there's an old idea, and I think it really is typical in religion, as the Michelangelo painting illustrates, or even in science fiction. This is the monolith from Arthur C. Clarke's Space Odyssey. And in all of these older ideas, the idea is that somehow the gods gave humans language. We were these languageless apes, and then boom, the next day we had language, and the rest is history. And I think it's an appealing idea, but I think it's a deeply wrong idea. And I think the way to replace it is to recognize that there are many different components of language, many different mechanisms that enter into our ability to learn and use language. I've just illustrated some of them up here. But if we want to understand language as a whole, we have to take all of these mechanisms and one by one work out which ones are shared with which other species, how do they work in the brain, and ultimately what are the genetic bases of these. So I think this multi-component view is a necessary antidote to this kind of monolithic view of language evolution. So how do we start in something like this? One of the first things that we did in this, in the process that led to this paper in Science with Noam Chomsky, is to just start to lay out the field. And something I quickly realized is that when I said language, I meant something different from what Noam Chomsky means when he says language. What I mean is basically all of the biological mechanisms that allow us to do language. What he meant was the very specific subset of mechanisms that are unique to humans, that are unique to language within human cognition. And so really different things. When he said language, that's what he meant. When I said language, I meant all the other stuff as well, speech perception and production and semantics, etc. So we realized that we needed to clarify this. And we introduced these terms, the faculty of language in a broad sense, FLB, and the faculty of language in the narrow sense. And the faculty of language in the broad sense is this sense that I used, everything that's involved, all of the different mechanisms. In the narrow sense, we hypothesized back in 2002 that there was only one key ingredient, one key mechanism of language within that subset of mechanisms, namely recursion. And the argument then, and it was plausible at the time, was that recursion is only found in language, and it's only found in human beings. I think the second part remains true, but empirical work has shown that recursion is involved in other human domains, like music or in visual perception. So I think actually by our current definition, the faculty of language in the narrow sense is an empty set. There's nothing in that set based on what we know today. So what I want to do today is introduce a different idea, the faculty of language in a derived sense. And the basic idea is that most of this stuff in the faculty of language in a broad sense is shared with other species. So this is a short list of stuff that we know exists from empirical work in non-human animals. And it's a very long list. And what that means is that most of the architecture of language is built on this shared core. And for biologists, that shouldn't be particularly surprising. But of course, we have language and other species don't. And these three pillars here, what I've called the three S's, signal, syntax, and semantics, represent three things that we know changed in our evolution in the last 6 million years from chimpanzees to humans. So language rests on this shared foundation, but also has a few unique or unusual characteristics in our own species. So I want to call this the faculty of language in the derived sense, or FLD, if you want to give it an acronym. And essentially, there are three components that we know very clearly. One is the capacity to control our vocal tract and create speech. Another is the capacity to use complex hierarchical syntax. And the third is our capacity to use basically theory of mind invested semantics. And for reasons of time, I'm only going to go through the first two, and rather rapidly at that. I won't have time to talk about semantics, but that could come up in the question. But these are three things that we know had to happen in the last 6 million years. So it's not quite on the 10 to the 10 scale, it's on the 10 to the 6 level. But in the last 6 million years, we got these things that aren't present in chimpanzees. And what I want to do for the rest of the talk is illustrate how we can use a comparative approach and a multi-component approach to unpack these different novel abilities of our species, understand their neural basis, and finally start to understand their genetic basis. And I'll start by talking about speech production in some detail. Then I'll switch to syntax and show you how we can actually ask animals about their syntactic abilities, which is not trivial. I'll end with a hypothesis about what makes syntax special, and then very quickly I'm just going to say why I think fossil DNA offers a very exciting way to test hypotheses about when these novelties arose in our species, or in our lineage. Okay, so leaping right into it, starting with speech, one of the oldest facts that we know about our nearest relatives is that unlike any normal 2-year-old child, an ape raised in a human home will never produce speech. It's never happened. There have been many examples where apes have been raised with humans. They learn to do lots of stuff. This is a little chimpanzee who learned to wash. She could tie her shoes. She could drive a car. I'm not sure she could actually play a guitar, but she could at least play around with a guitar. So it's not because apes are not intelligent. It's not because apes don't have imitation, but they lack a very specific ability to imitate the sounds in the environment around them. So they can't hear a sound like hello and actually produce this. Okay? That's an interesting fact, but it's a fact that we want to try and understand. So how do we pull this apart? What is it that keeps apes from speaking? And there are two hypotheses that are very old. I mean, really, you can track them back almost to Aristotle, but Darwin laid them out very clearly. One is that it has something to do with the vocal tract, with the vocal anatomy, and the second is that it has to do with the neural wiring, with either the brain or the connection between the brain and the vocal tract. So, okay, we have two clear hypotheses, both of them a priori plausible. Let's try and test between these hypotheses. Could, of course, be both as well. So, starting with the vocal anatomy, it's been known for many years, since before Darwin's time, that humans are weird in that our vocal tract has descended in the throat. So, unlike most mammals, early on in development, the larynx begins to fall down in our throat, pulling the tongue down with it. And that gives us a very different vocal tract morphology from a chimpanzee or a dog or a cat. So this is a weird thing about our species that plausibly has something to do with speech, with our capacity for speech. I'm sorry that played automatically, but it doesn't matter. So here's this is an X-ray of me speaking. What I want you to pay attention to is the outline of the tongue, which is basically the outline right here. Okay, and watch what we do with these remodeled vocal tracts when we speak.
A rainbow is division of white light into many beautiful colors.
Okay, so it's very quick, but you can see that the tongue is basically just dancing around in the throat. And the idea is that by lowering our larynx and pulling the tongue down with it, we gain a capacity to change the shape of our vocal tract much more than other species. And here it is slowed down again. Okay? So speech in all languages, this is as true in Chinese or other tonal languages as it is in English or Dutch or German or whatever, relies on these very rapid and controlled movements of the tongue, which control what are called formant frequencies, which are the resonances of the vocal tract. And those are the key components of speech, of understandable speech, of vowels and consonants. Okay, not tone, but everything else. So the argument then is, okay, we're different from non-human animals. This difference is tied to the acoustics of speech. And so a very long-standing argument is that the reason chimpanzees can't produce speech, can't imitate sounds, is because they don't have this kind of vocal tract. Now that idea was based on old anatomy, on anatomical studies that I've always been a bit suspicious of. So here's an old paper from the 1940s. Victor Negus cuts a goat's head in half, a dead goat, and claims, based on this anatomy, that goats can't breathe through their mouth. So in other words, that this represents the capabilities of a goat, that it's kind of fixed. And I've always thought you can't really judge what a living animal can do just by cutting a dead animal's head in half. So I set out when I was a postdoc at Harvard with Fuzz Crompton to study this question in living animals. And we were the first to successfully do this, to get animals to vocalize in an X-ray setup, so to do what people have been doing with speech for a long time. And what we saw, this was a young goat who we induced to vocalize by playing his mother's bleats from another room, and what we saw was a great surprise.
The parse? No. Not this part of it.
Look at this area right here.
Then they get used to the sound.
So hopefully what you can see there is this thing popping down out of the throat. And we immediately were like, well, there's only one thing that could be. That's the larynx doing exactly what Negus said would be impossible based on the dead, based on the static anatomy. So this was exciting. It suggested that that you do need to look at living animals in order to judge the capabilities of their vocal tract. So we've pushed that a lot further. We've done this in many different mammals now, and we find the same thing in all cases, that at least some vocalizations involve this kind of dynamic rearrangement of the vocal anatomy. And this is particularly nice in dogs, where we've done 10 different individuals. We always see the same thing, that when a dog barks, it pulls the larynx down and pulls the tongue with it into something very close to a human vocal tract configuration. So I'll show you this slowed down. So that's the larynx with the vocal folds, and you can see the tongue right is flat, and now when he barks, he pulls it way down into the throat. Again, we've seen this in every mammal species that we've looked at, so this kind of vocal flexibility seems to be something that was present in the ancestral mammal. That goes way back, way before the last 6 million years. And I published this work a long time ago in 2000, and I thought this put an end to this idea that we can judge what an animal can do based on its static anatomy of the dead animal. But unfortunately, this myth, it's a very popular myth that the reason chimpanzees can't speak is because of their anatomy, and it kept going. So a couple years ago, my colleagues and I decided, okay, let's really do this solidly. Let's replicate the early experiments that were done with dead monkeys, but now use data from living monkeys. And so we got monkeys to do a wide variety of eating, vocalizing, making lip smacks, and other things that monkeys like to do. This is just one example of a grunt vocalization. Okay, so we gathered a whole set of these videos, we traced each of the vocal tract configurations, and then we used those tracings to produce a computer model of a monkey vocal tract, which you can see down here. Now once you have a model of the air, of the cross-sectional areas, the air chambers, you can very quickly pull out these formant frequencies, which are the resonances of the vocal tract. That's straight physics. So the key thing here is that we now have a representation of what a living monkey can do with its vocal tract. We can compute what the vowels that would be produced by that vocal tract would sound like, and that gives us basically a monkey vocal tract space. This is the first formant versus the second formant that you can see here. And what you can see is there's quite a variety of things that a monkey could do with its vocal tract if you look at living monkeys. And to take that one step further, we compared that with the human vowel space. So in red we have the human vowel space, and in this dotted line we have our monkey vocal tract space. We generated a bunch of vowels from that. We showed that humans are very easily able to discriminate among these different vowels. And thus I think we've really shown that the vocal tract anatomy itself is not a crucial limitation. And just to make the point a little more clear, rather than just showing the data, I'm going to play you now an example of our computer model trying to imitate my wife. So I'll first play my wife. Will you marry me? So we've resynthesized my wife saying, will you marry me, with a monkey source. And now, here's the monkey vocal tract saying the same thing. Will you marry me? Will you marry me? And I hope you can all say, well, it's not crystal clear. It's not as clear as a human, but it's still very easily intelligible. And that's all done with empirically attested vocal tracts that we know a monkey can make. So hopefully now, this was just published, so we have to wait a little bit longer, but hopefully this will put to rest forever the idea that the reason monkeys can't talk is because of their vocal anatomy. I think that really at any point in mammalian evolution where the selection on vocal control came into play, that the primate vocal anatomy would be perfectly adequate to support understandable speech. So that takes us to the second hypothesis, namely the brain, which probably many of you in the room were thinking that's a more plausible hypothesis anyway. That's actually what Darwin concluded. So what about the brain is a big place. There's a lot going on there, and there's many comparisons we can make with the chimpanzee brain, namely that ours is 3 times larger, et cetera, et cetera. So can we be more specific about what had to change in the human brain to give us this capacity to imitate sounds? And again, the answer is yes. There's a very clear hypothesis. This dates back, again, it's quite an old hypothesis dating back to the 1950s. And the basic idea is quite straightforward. In most mammals, the connections between the motor cortex and the neurons, the motor neurons that control the larynx and the tongue and the other articulators are indirect. So you can see these in a cat or in a chimpanzee. Neurons from motor cortex project down onto interneurons in the brainstem, and those interneurons then are the ones that have the final connection to the motor neurons. So that's the normal situation in mammals. In humans, we have gained, in addition to those indirect connections, we have gained a novel set of connections, direct cortical to ambigual, in the case of the larynx, motor neuron connections, onto the neurons that actually do the work. So in other words, what we have is a set of connections directly from neocortex that aren't present in other non-human primates. And that's been looked at in a large variety of non-human primates, so I think we're pretty safe in concluding that these direct connections are not there. So great, this is a hypothesis. It's based on basically one comparison, primates against humans. So the question is, how could we test this? How can we make this more than a plausible argument? And this is where this broad comparative approach that I mentioned at the beginning becomes important, because as I'm sure most of you are aware, many different species have, independently of us, evolved a capacity to imitate sounds in their environment, in some cases even imitate speech. So let me just give you 2 examples. This is a myna bird that I met in northern Italy. And well, you'll hear me in the background with my bad Italian trying to induce this myna to talk. He does a bunch of myna stuff first, but whoops.
Buonasera. Come stai? Come stai?
Come stai?
Buonasera.
Buonasera. Buonasera. Buonasera.
So my Italian colleagues assure me that his accent is better than mine. So it's a real illustration. No chimpanzee has ever done anything like this, but these very distant relatives have independently evolved this capacity. Here's a maybe even more surprising example. This was a seal, a baby seal who was born, his mother died during birth, and he was born into the arms of a fisherman in Maine. And they put him in the bathtub. They named him Hoover because he ate so much. They put him in the bathtub, and they raised him until he was a young guy and got out of control. And then he was donated to the New England Aquarium, where when he became sexually mature, several years after living with the fisherman, he started making these sounds. So if you're not a native English speaker, this might not be entirely clear what he's saying. He's saying Hoover, his name. He's saying, hey, 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 hey. And then he says, get over here. So with a strong Maine fisherman's accent, here's a slightly clearer example. So again, amazing that a chimpanzee can't do this, but if you get a seal at the right time and throw him in the bathtub and talk to him, he will produce not just English, but with a very convincing imitation of a Maine fisherman's accent after a couple of beers. So it's so what this illustrates is that despite this ability not being shared with other primates, it is shared with many other species, and this is how we can test a hypothesis. This is how we can test a hypothesis like this direct connections hypothesis, namely by looking at all of the species that have independently evolved this capacity for vocal imitation. And in all of these cases, if the hypothesis is correct, we should find direct connections from their equivalent of motor cortex down to the motor neurons that control vocalization. This has only been done in some species, but the 2 species where it's been looked at, namely songbirds and parrots, which independently evolved this capacity, the prediction is upheld. So birds who imitate sounds have direct connections from their equivalent of motor cortex onto the neurons that control the syrinx, and other birds that aren't vocal learners don't have these connections. So chickens or owls do not have these direct connections. So I think what all this illustrates is not only that we can come up with plausible hypotheses about specific human abilities, but also how we can test these hypotheses using a broad comparative database. So I think the fact that we need to work with living animals and that we need to take a very broad perspective is part of the answer to our problem of how can you study something that's unique, namely language. But, of course, you might be thinking, speech is not language. Speech is only one part of language. It's the part that enables most of us to communicate. But if we were born without hearing, we could learn sign and we could communicate that way. We can all communicate via writing. So speech is just one of the output modalities of language, not language itself. So now I want to turn to something that I think everyone agrees is core to language. Without this, you don't have language, namely syntax, namely our capacity to combine phonemes into syllables, into words, into sentences, into discourse, this hierarchical structuring of our utterances, without which we wouldn't be able to communicate anything that we can think about. So again, we can start by asking, what about chimpanzees? And as I'm sure many of you know, many chimpanzees, despite their inability to learn speech, have been trained to either communicate via signs or to communicate with keyboards. This is a very famous example, namely Kanzi, the bonobo. Kanzi communicates both via gestures and with this keypad. He understands the meanings of all of these different little symbols, and he can also do things like, say, gimme, which he does gesturally, and then push grape, or gimme apple, or gimme tickle. So he can basically put these things together into a very simple syntax. That's essentially all he does, is put two things together, but he does so in a sort of ordered way. So if we wanted to be generous, we could say that's chimpanzee syntax. That's what a bonobo can do with syntax. But of course, that's not all we do in language, at least beyond the age of about 2. We do something much more complicated. So think about this sentence: the boy who kicked the dog chased the girl. Now, if you're awake and paying attention and understand English, if I asked you who chased the girl, think about it. The answer is the boy, right? But why do we know that? How can we parse this sentence when there's this whole who kicked the dog thing in there? And the answer is, of course, that we connect the boy to chase the girl, despite all of these intervening words. But if you ask Kanzi this question, he might say, well, it says right there, the dog chased the girl. He might be kind of angry if he didn't get rewarded for saying the dog is the one who did it. Okay? So what this illustrates is that in order to properly understand human language, you need to have this capacity to build things into hierarchical structures and to parse those hierarchical structures. Okay, so that's what I wanted to understand. Can animals do that? Or which animals can do that, which animals can't? How do we do that? How do we ask, this is easy as an illustration, but it's not very easy to ask animals, give them sentences and ask them their meanings. So we use a very simple experimental approach to address the question of how animals can parse sentences. It's called artificial grammar learning. And just to illustrate this, I want to pretend that you're an undergraduate in one of our experiments. So you come in, and I'm going to give you a bunch of data. The idea is that we just expose you to positive examples, and then we test you afterwards to see what rule you've pulled out of those examples. So here's a nice simple example. Sop, soplar. That's data point 1. Son, sonlar. You might think you've already got the rule, but wait, there's a little more data. Dev, devler, and guler. Okay, that's your data. Now, in reality, we would do hundreds of examples. We would give a lot more, but since you're smart people, I bet you can get it. I bet you can get the rule from this. Okay? So I'll also give you a little cheat sheet here. Up at the top is the data that you've gotten. And now the key thing in these artificial grammar experiments is now I'm going to present some examples, and your goal is simply to use whatever rule you figured out to predict what these new examples should be. Okay? So let's start with the first one, con or conlar. Who thinks it should be conlar? Raise your hand. Who thinks it should be conler? Good. Okay, you guys have a future in linguistics. You're correct. It's conlar. Okay, douze. Should it be douzlar? Raise your hand. Douzler? Okay, that's pretty good. Usually only linguists perform at that level. Biologists, there's usually at least some hands that go up for the other one. You're absolutely correct. Congratulations. You have learned the rule for Turkish vowel harmony with only being exposed to positive examples of these 4 bits of data. And that's how artificial grammar learning works. It doesn't always work that well. Our animals don't usually get 100% correct, but this is how we do it with animals. Now the second problem, so that's our empirical method. The second problem is how do we make the question of grammatical complexity into something that we can quantify and test? And here we've been lucky enough to borrow a whole body of mathematical and formal theory that goes back to Alan Turing and was put in its kind of modern format by Noam Chomsky. It's called formal language theory. I don't have time to go into all the details about it, but what it gives us is a sense, a map of the complexity dimension of language. And what we know from lots of previous work is that humans need to go beyond this simplest level, which is called finite state grammar, into something beyond that. It's called context-free and context-sensitive grammars. Okay? So we know that human languages are up there, and what we want to know now is whether animals can also parse rules at that level. And here are two simple examples of these two different grammars. So finite state grammars only allow you to do sequential organization. So an example would be A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. I can do that as long as I want. That would be a finite state grammar. So that's our top grammar up there. The bottom grammar is more interesting. It requires a context-free grammar because you need to match the number of A's and the number of B's. So only if the number of A's and B's match is it a well-formed string. And that's something that mathematically we can show, it's a theorem, that requires a level of processing beyond that of these finite state grammars. So a lot of the early work has worked with these two particular grammars, and I did some of it myself. So I did this study when I was at Harvard with comparing humans and monkeys with these two different grammars. And what you can see from this data is that monkeys, given the simple rule, this A, B, A, B, A, B sequential rule, monkeys are able to discriminate the violations from the well-formed strings, just like human beings are. So there's no difference. Well, there's no significant difference there. But when we get to this more complicated rule, the rule that requires you to remember the first part and match it to the second part, the monkeys failed time and time again. And this has now been replicated in many different species. This seems to be something that goes beyond the capabilities of what monkeys and lots of other animals can do. And we have a nice control here because given that they learned this, it's not because they can't learn, it's not because they're not paying attention, it's not because they're not motivated, et cetera, et cetera. So this particular study and many that followed were done with auditory stimuli. And one of the worries that we found, or that we ran into, is that maybe this isn't really about syntax per se, but it's more about auditory working memory. It's more about their capacity to store things. So how do you get around that? The answer that we've been pursuing more recently is to use these visual grammars. The structure, the formal structure is exactly the same, but now rather than having human syllables or monkey syllables representing these A's and B's, we use these funny little abstract tiles. So this is an A tile, and this is a B tile. So this is A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. And these two are these A to the N, B to the N. 2 A's, 2 B's, 3 A's, 3 B's. And in the first set of experiments that we did, we've now done this with chimpanzees as well. We used pigeons, which need no introduction. They're workhorse species. They're reasonably smart, but not exactly the brightest birds on the block. Whereas these guys, these are keas. These are New Zealand parrots that are famous for their intelligence. If you ask if any New Zealander who's interacted with these things is like, oh, these keas are brilliant birds. You know, they do all kinds, they manipulate the environment, they've learned how to tear apart cars, et cetera, et cetera. And in our lab, we have the largest collection of keas outside of New Zealand. They have passed test after test, particularly for things like manipulating objects and learning about the way the physical world works. So these are smart birds. They have some of the largest brains relative to body size of any bird. So I wasn't particularly optimistic about the pigeons, but I was very optimistic that these guys would be able to go beyond what other species have done, given this new visual grammar. And the people who did this work were Nina Stobbe and Tecumseh Fitch on the keas, and Louis Aust on the pigeons. Well, the good news is that all the birds were able to learn the basic task. This is an operant task where they have to choose between A to the N, B to the N versus A, B to the N. They just make a choice by pecking on the screen. They were able to generalize to some extent. So they were able to do things like use new tiles. We could rotate these things 90 degrees, and they could do that. Now everything beyond this, the pigeons fail, but the keas were able to do it. So the keas were able, for example, to do it without color. The pigeons failed to do that. They were also able to generalize beyond the n that we trained them with. So here we have 4 A's and 4 B's. Keys were able to handle that. So this is all looking really good, all looking really exciting. But the crucial thing to show that you're actually comparing the group of A's and the group of B's is the number. And what you need to do is be able to say AA, BBB, or AAA, BBB is not a valid stimulus. And that, unfortunately, so here's the data. Here's the key is generalizing perfectly, 100%, to the longer stimuli. But when it comes to these foils, to the mismatched stimuli, the Kias failed completely. They were a chance. And even when we gave them intensive training with food rewards, they didn't seem to be able to make that distinction, to be able to do something that we totally trivially do as humans, symmetry. 2 A's, 2 B's, yes. 3 A's, 2 B's, no. They couldn't learn that, even with training, these very smart birds. You might ask, what are they doing? So we used a Bayesian approach. I won't go into the details. This is my PhD student, Andre Ravignani. And what he found is that the Kias are indeed very smart. What basically all of our Kias did was they used a little local rule that enabled them to distinguish between these two sets of strings. In this case, they just looked for a BA transition anywhere in the stimulus. And if there was one of those, they'd say yes. And for the other one, they almost all did the same thing. Just look for a BB at the end, and then you can say, yes, this is an A to the end, B to the end, or one of them looked for an AA at the beginning. Okay? Now, what does this give them? It gives them an ability to actually perform at 100% correct until we get to the test stage. But it's a totally local rule. It's a silly little, just look at 2 tiles and ignore the rest kind of rule, which our humans never do. Humans look at these things and they parse the whole, and the birds look at it and they come up with a very clever trick. Why don't our undergraduates think of this? So Kias are smart, they're just not smart in the same way that we are, and they don't have the same proclivity to parse a string in terms of its hierarchical structure. Okay? So here's where we stand at present. Lots of different species have learned lots of different finite state grammars, but we remain the only species which has been shown to be able to go beyond that to this hierarchical structuring of strings, of input strings. So now I'm coming to the end. I want to end by suggesting what it is that changed in our brain that enabled us that gave us this capacity to do hierarchical structuring. I call it Genderophelia, which is from the root for tree and love. So we are lovers of trees in the sense that we're born, even as babies, with a proclivity, with an ability and a proclivity to take strings and analyze them as hierarchical wholes, to analyze them into parts and then ask how those parts are related to one another. Now, I don't think this is unique to language. I think we have very clear evidence that it's also true in music. This is a key part of what music is all about. But also in our visual experiments, people do it with visual data equally well. So I think this is a domain general ability. It goes beyond any particular cognitive domain, and it applies across at least music and language, and probably to the arts, architecture, and social hierarchy, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So that's a hypothesis. Again, we can ask, how can we test this? The beautiful thing about this formal language theory is that it provides a model of the kind of machine. So this is a very specific computational model that's adequate to parse any finite state grammar. It's called a finite state automaton. And the basic idea is essentially that you march through the input and you go from state to state. You only know your local state. And at the end, if you're in an accept state, you say, yes, that was a good string. Okay, that's all a finite state automaton can do. It's very useful. It's a very powerful method, but it doesn't allow you to go to this next stage. To go to the next stage, you have to remember something about the past. And the next level up, the next level of computational complexity is called a context-free acceptor. So now we're into the next level of the formal language hierarchy. And you can see that the only addition is that there's a memory, a push-down stack, which enables you to say, okay, I've parsed all my A's, there's 3 of them, stick it on the stack, and now do my work, count the number of B's, and then compare that. Okay, so this is the minimum level that you need to go to the next level of hierarchical grammars. And now we can say, okay, that's an abstract model, what about the brain? So in the human brain, there's quite a bit of evidence that we have such a push-down store, and that it's actually relatively well localized to the inferior frontal gyrus. So the hypothesis that I'm currently working with, and I think it's consistent with a lot of data, I'll just show you some of it, is that the inferior frontal gyrus, sometimes called Broca's area, basically acts as this domain general store for all of the rest of the brain to be able to offload intermediate results, stick them on this stack, stick them into this auxiliary memory, and then later retrieve those so that they can make a comparison, so that they can build up these hierarchical structures. So what's the data? Again, I can't go through all of it, but just in general, we know that in many different animal species, the prefrontal cortex acts as a kind of hub that connects other parts of the brain, and things like working memory are important in that. So specifically in humans, we have lots of brain imaging data. This is one study of 20 that shows that the activation of Broca's area gets greater and greater the more the hierarchical complexity of the input strings. So this is just a beautiful study by Pallier et al. And they used 2-part, 3-part, 4-part, 6-part, and 12-part sentences with 12 words or 4 words or whatever. And they were able to show that independent of meaning, so removing the meaning from this, you get a very nice, clear connection between the activity in Broca's area and the size of these hierarchical structures. Okay, so brain imaging data is consistent with this. If we now ask about the anatomy, the nice paper, relatively recent paper by Natalie Shaker and colleagues, showed that this is the part of our brain that has expanded most relative to chimpanzees. So Broca's area, BA44, BA45, have expanded more than any other brain region that we know relative to chimpanzees. It's not that chimpanzees don't have it, it's just that it's very small. Ours is much, much bigger. Okay, so that's the sort of anatomical thing. And then I think even more crucially, Rilling and others have used DTI and track tracing to show that in humans, the connections between this area and the rest of the brain are incredibly massive. So in green, we see all these different connections going into the parietal cortex, the occipital cortex, and all of temporal cortex. So this area is uniquely well connected in humans compared to, for example, macaques, where there's almost no connection. It ends basically in the parietal lobes and doesn't make it down. Monkeys have a different connectivity between this sort of ventral path, but we are uniquely developed in this dorsal path. Okay? So what we have then are 3 things: the brain imaging data, the anatomical expansion of the real estate of Broca's, and then the connectivity. And I think all of these together are consistent with this idea that basically if you want to develop a brain that goes beyond simple sequential processing, if you want to build up a hierarchical structure, you do it by taking an area, a pre-existing area that acted as a hub, and then just doing it on steroids, connecting it to everything and improving its capacity by increasing the number of neurons in it. Okay, so I guess I still am doing okay time-wise. Balash, should I finish? So, okay, I want to end now with a promissory note, so to speak, about how we can test hypotheses about when. So I've told you a lot about what is it that we needed to get in order to get these novel capacities that chimpanzees don't have. But I haven't said anything about when this happened in the last 6 million years. So sometime since we diverged from chimpanzees. But the key question then is, okay, was it Homo erectus? Was it Neanderthals? At what point did these different capacities, these different novel abilities of human beings come into play? And I think the assumption for many people is that, well, the old idea, as I told you at the beginning, is that it happened all at once. Noam Chomsky has been a pretty famous proponent of this idea, but I now know that he was just talking about syntax, so he didn't mean that language appeared all at once, but rather that this hierarchical syntax appeared at once. But I think pretty much everyone agrees that in this long period, this 6 million years from our last common ancestor with chimpanzees to modern Homo sapiens, there were several intermediate stages, several well-attested fossil primates, and we can hypothesize that different of these abilities, whether it's speech or syntax or semantics, arrived at different times. So that's fine, that's a sort of framework, but how could we test these? There's lots of hypotheses out there. They go by different models of proto-language. So for example, Darwin thought that it all started with song, that we first developed the ability to control our vocal tract that we use for singing, like birds or gibbons or whatever, and then only later did we get meaning, semantics, and syntax. Other people have suggested that it started with sign, so that first we developed language in the sign domain, and then only later, at the end, did we move into the speech domain. And I think the crucial idea about all of these hypotheses is they make predictions about when different things were acquired. Okay, so Darwin says speech should come first. The sign hypothesis says that speech should come last. So it might be the end of the story. In 2002, we thought it was the end of the story. Actually, in 2005, we thought it was the end of the story. But now we know that there's a new source of data, a very exciting source of data, that can enable us to actually go back in time by recovering the DNA from fossil hominids. And now this is quite clearly done in both Denisovans and Neanderthals. Svante Pääbo, I guess, who was here, I'm sure told you all about this. It was a non-trivial accomplishment to get the Neanderthal genome, but now we have a very good Neanderthal genome that we can go through gene by gene and ask to what extent are genes that we, modern humans, have that are different from chimpanzees, were they shared with Neanderthals or not? Okay? And I think this is only the beginning. We've just got the first good mitochondrial DNA from Homo erectus, but if the technology continues to develop, I think we'll get more than that. So I think it's a very exciting time for this. And so I just want to end with one gene that probably you've already heard about since Svante Pääbo was here, namely the FOXP2 gene. This is the one gene that I think we can really clearly say modern humans have it, chimpanzees, or that we have a special allele that chimpanzees lack, and that we can actually recover this gene from Neanderthals, and we know roughly what it does. So FOXP2 is a transcription factor. In the human modified version, it plays a very particular role in learning. In people who have damage to the FOXP2, to this gene, in humans who have damage to it, their speech control, their motor control of their vocal apparatus is severely degraded. So they have a really hard time learning to speak, but they have normal perception and normal understanding of semantics, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a gene that we can say very clearly it's tied to improved motor control of the sort that we know humans have and chimpanzees lack. This is, in the early days, back in the 2000s, people called this a language gene. I think that's really misleading. This is a gene for a particular component of speech, not for all of language. But again, it fits all of the requirements that we would need to test this hypothesis. And as probably many of you already know, we now know that the human allele, these modified amino acids, the human allele was shared with both Denisovans and Neanderthals. Okay, so what that means is that the evolution of this novel allele can be pushed back to our common ancestor with Neanderthals about 500,000 years ago. And what that tells us is that one of the key ingredients of speech, namely good vocal control, vocal motor control, was already present in these extinct hominids. So Neanderthals had an enhanced ability to talk relative to chimpanzees. That doesn't mean that they had language, and I think most people agree that whatever Neanderthals had, it was some kind of proto-language. It wasn't full language, because otherwise their technology wouldn't have been so stagnant, and they wouldn't have been replaced so quickly when modern Homo sapiens arrived on the scene in Europe. Now, interestingly, there is a modified binding site that's present in humans relative to, so this is a cis-regulatory upstream binding site. So that's something that does differentiate humans from Neanderthals. So it appears there has been selection on the control of this transcription factor since our divergence from chimpanzees. But the key thing is that they already shared this key allele, and what that enables us to do, is to basically we have a fixed point, namely our last common ancestor with chimpanzees, and now we have a new fixed point, our common ancestor with Neanderthals and modern humans, and these guys already had speech. What they had for syntax or what they had for semantics, we still don't know. And the problem here is, fortunately, it's not about having a time machine, it's about just understanding how the human genome works. So doing normal science, doing the sort of science that I'm sure many of you are doing with, say, knock-in mice or knock-out mice, we need to understand more about the genes that underlie human-specific behaviors, like syntax or semantics, if we want to make sense of this. But with each gene that comes on, once we know, for example, here's a gene that's involved in theory of mind from studies of autists, we can immediately go to the Neanderthal genome and ask, did they share that allele with us or not? So that's why I think this is exciting, because we really can imagine that as we understand the genome, we're going to get answers to these questions about when different things happened almost for free. Just dial up the Neanderthal genome on the web and check. Okay, so that's it. My general conclusions. Hopefully you'll keep in mind birds and seals, etc., as an important part of our search for understanding of human language. I illustrated that with speech. And hopefully, please don't walk away thinking that the key thing that keeps a chimpanzee from talking is his larynx or his tongue. I think it's very clear that it's neural. I think we're starting to get a glimpse of what makes syntax special, and I've hypothesized that it's this capacity that humans have and this proclivity for attributing hierarchical structure to signals. And then finally, I think we're in a very exciting time where in the next couple decades, we're going to be able to test these hypotheses as new fossil DNA comes in, and we'll actually be able to get some real insights into this last major transition in evolution. So thank you for your attention. Thanks to all the people who did the work, many of whom I named as we went along, and thanks to the people who funded this work, the ERC grant in particular.